The morning my son-in-law told me I was too old to be anyone's problem. I was lying in a hospital bed with 3 cracked ribs, a bruised lung, and an IV needle in my left arm. I remember staring at the ceiling tiles and thinking 64 years of living. And it comes down to this. My name is Walter. I spent 31 years building a small but honest electrical contracting business in Columbus, Ohio. Nothing flashy. We did commercial retrofits, school district contracts, the occasional municipal job. I employed 11 people at our peak. I coached Little League for 6 years. I served on the school board. I paid my taxes early. I was, by every measure I understood, a decent man. My wife Carol passed 9 years ago. Breast cancer, caught late. The 2 years between her diagnosis and her death were the longest of my life, and losing her left a silence in the house that I never quite figured out how to fill. But I had my daughter Renee, and eventually I had my son-in-law Marcus. Renee met Marcus at a conference in Chicago. She was 31, working in marketing for a mid-size healthcare company. He was 34, handsome, confident, the kind of man who walks into a room and assumes it was waiting for him. I tried to like him from the start. I genuinely did. He was smart, well-dressed, always said the right things at the right moments. But there was something underneath all of that polish that I could never quite name. A coldness, maybe. A calculation behind the eyes. They married 3 years after they met. I paid for the wedding nearly $40,000, which I gave freely and without complaint, because Renee was happy, and happy was all I ever wanted for her. Marcus thanked me with a firm handshake and moved on to the next conversation. In the years that followed, I told myself the distance I felt from Marcus was just personality difference. Some people are warm, and some aren't. I focused on the good. He treated Renee well on the surface. They bought a nice house in Dublin. They seemed stable. When they had trouble conceiving and went through 2 rounds of IVF, I helped quietly with the costs without being asked. Renee cried on the phone and said, "Dad, you didn't have to do that." I told her that's what fathers are for. I did things like that more times than I want to count. When Marcus wanted to start a side investment portfolio and was short on capital, he came to me with a proposal, very formal, printed pages with projected returns, and I gave him $60,000 as a loan. He said he'd pay it back within 3 years. That was 5 years before the accident. He never paid back a single dollar. When I brought it up gently the one time, he laughed and said, "Walter, come on, you're family." I let it go. I tell you all of this not to complain. I tell you because you need to understand who Marcus was before you understand who he showed himself to be on that Tuesday in March. I was driving home from a client site on the west side of Columbus. It was mid-afternoon, dry road, nothing unusual. A delivery truck ran a red light at the intersection of Henderson and Olentangy and hit my truck on the passenger side. The impact spun me into a utility pole. I don't remember much after the airbag deployed. I woke up in the ambulance, and the paramedic was asking me to squeeze his hand. The ER nurses were kind. The attending physician told me I had 3 fractured ribs on my left side, a pulmonary contusion, bruised lung, a mild concussion, and significant soft tissue damage to my left shoulder. They admitted me and said I'd likely be there 4 to 5 days, depending on how the lung responded. The hospital called Renee as my emergency contact. She called Marcus. Marcus arrived at the hospital that evening. I remember being relieved to see a familiar face. He stood in the doorway of my room for a moment, looked at the monitors, the IV lines, the compression cuffs on my legs, and his expression didn't carry worry. It carried inconvenience. He sat down in the chair beside my bed and asked me a few surface-level questions. How did it happen? Was the other driver cited? What does the insurance say? He looked at his phone twice while I was answering. Then he asked where Renee was, and I told him she was flying in from a work trip in Dallas. She'd be here by the next morning. He nodded, stood up, and said, "Okay, I've got an early meeting. You're in good hands here." I said, "Marcus, I'm going to be here a few days." He said, "Right, I'll check in." And he walked out. He did not come back. Not that night. Not the next day. Not the day after that. Renee arrived the next morning, and she was everything he wasn't. She held my hand and cried and stayed most of the day. But she had to fly back for a critical presentation 2 days later. And once she was gone, I was alone. On the 3rd day, I called Marcus directly. His voicemail picked up. I left a message, nothing dramatic. Just said I could use some company and maybe someone to bring a few things from my house. He texted back 2 hours later. Walter, you've got nurses. You're fine. On the fourth day, a nurse named Diane, a no-nonsense woman from Cleveland, who had the best timing of anyone I've ever met, came in to check my oxygen levels and found me quieter than usual. She asked if I was okay. I told her my son-in-law hadn't come back since the first night. She looked at me for a moment and said, "Honey, you'd be surprised how many people I see in here alone." That hit me differently than it should have, maybe. I'm 64, not ancient. I run 3 miles 3 times a week, or I did before this. I own a business. I have friends. But lying in that hospital bed, alone for the fourth day, something settled into me that felt permanent. Renee called that evening. She sounded stressed and distracted, and she mentioned, almost in passing, that Marcus had been talking about my house. "He keeps bringing up the Grandview property, Dad. He thinks maybe with everything going on, it might be a good time to think about downsizing." My house in Grandview Heights was purchased in 1998. Carol and I raised Renee there. I'd paid it off completely in 2019. At current market value, it was worth somewhere around $620,000. I said, "What do you mean, a good time?" Renee paused. "He just thinks with the accident, and, you're not getting younger, that maybe a smaller place makes more sense." He mentioned, "Maybe we could find you something in a 55-plus community." 55-plus community. I'm 64. I still run the company. I told Renee I'd think about it, and I said good night. And I lay in that hospital room in the dark, and I thought very carefully about the last 5 years. The $60,000 loan, never repaid. The wedding I funded entirely. The IVF costs. The birthday dinners where Marcus spent 40 minutes on his phone. The Christmas where he didn't come because of prior plans. It was the first Christmas after Carol died. Renee came alone and cried in the kitchen. The comment he made once at a family dinner, when I mentioned I was tired after a long job, and he said, "Maybe it's time to wind down, Walter. At your age, running a business is a young man's game. At your age, and now, you're in good hands with the nurses. You're fine." I asked Diane the next morning if she could do me a small favor. I asked if I could borrow her phone charger, and if there was a quiet place where I could make some calls without being interrupted. She arranged for me to use the small consultation room down the hall for an hour. I called my attorney first. His name is Dennis Holt, a man I've known for 20 years, who handled Carol's estate and the original partnership documents for my business. I told him what was happening. He listened without interrupting. When I was finished, he said, "Walter, I want you to come in when you're discharged. Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and don't say anything specific to Marcus about your financial situation until we've talked." I asked him if he could also pull up the terms of the loan I gave Marcus 5 years ago. I had drafted it as a promissory note, informal, but signed. Dennis said he'd find it. Then I called my business partner, Ray, who had been with me for 19 years. I told him I'd be out for a few more weeks and asked him to make sure nothing unusual came across my desk. I told him if Marcus reached out to the company for any reason, to let me know immediately. Ray said, "Has something happened?" I said, "Just being careful." The 5th day, Marcus came back to the hospital. He arrived mid-morning, dressed in a sport coat, which struck me as odd for a hospital visit. He sat down, made brief small talk about the weather and traffic, and then he placed a folder on the tray table in front of me. Inside were 2 documents. One was a real estate agent's market analysis for my Grandview home. The other was what appeared to be a draft agreement for a voluntary asset transfer my house, transferred into a joint trust with Renee and Marcus, listed as co-trustees, with a clause that authorized them to manage and liquidate assets as appropriate. He said, "I've been doing some thinking, Walter. You've got a big house you don't need anymore. The market is strong right now. If we move on this in the next few weeks, we're looking at a clean $600,000, maybe more." I've already talked to a couple of agents. I looked at those papers for a long moment. Then I looked at him. I said, "Marcus, you haven't visited me in 4 days. He said, "I've been handling things, making sure you have options." I said, "I didn't ask you to handle anything." He leaned back slightly and said, "Look, I'm just being practical here. You're getting older, Walter. This accident is a wake-up call. Renee and I want to make sure you're taken care of, but we need to have the right structures in place to do that. This is actually about protecting you." Protecting me. I picked up the folder, straightened the papers, and set it back on the tray table. I said, "Leave these with me. I'll look them over." He seemed satisfied. He left within 20 minutes. That same afternoon, I called Dennis Holt again. I told him what Marcus had brought. Dennis's voice got very quiet in the way it does when he's thinking fast. He said, "That asset transfer language, that's not a protection document, Walter. That gives them full discretionary authority. Do not sign it under any circumstances." He paused. "I want to send you something to read tonight. And Walter, when you get home, come see me the day after." Renee called that evening again. She sounded different this time, quieter, hesitant. She said, "Dad, Marcus told me he showed you the paperwork." There was something uncertain in her voice that I hadn't expected. I asked her directly, "Renee, did you ask him to bring that to me?" Long pause. Then, "He said he'd talk to you about it and that you were open to it." "Dad, I didn't know he'd already drafted paperwork." That pause told me everything I needed. She hadn't known the extent of it. Marcus had moved ahead of her. Whether she fully understood what that document meant, I wasn't sure. But I knew my daughter well enough to hear the difference between her going along with something and her being its author. This had Marcus's fingerprints, not hers. I said, "Don't worry about it right now. I just want to come home." The discharge came on day 6. Diane walked me to the door and handed me a bag with my belongings. She patted my arm and said, "Take care of yourself." And I mean that in all the ways. I spent the first 2 days home resting, which I hated but did because my ribs insisted on it. On the 3rd day, Ray drove me to Dennis Holt's office. We sat in Dennis's conference room for 2 hours. The promissory note for $60,000 had a clause I'd forgotten it. Stipulated that if the loan was not repaid within 5 years, I had the right to pursue the balance plus 8% annual interest. 5 years had passed 8 months ago. The total Marcus owed me, with interest, was now just over $88,000. Dennis walked me through the asset transfer document Marcus had drafted. He pointed out 3 specific clauses that would have given Marcus effectively unilateral decision-making authority over the sale of my property, even over Renee's objection, due to a secondary provision buried in Section 4. He said, "This was not written by a real estate agent. Someone with legal knowledge helped draft this." We also discussed my will, which I had last updated when Carol died. Dennis recommended a full revision. We spent an hour on it. I made changes that reflected the reality of who had shown up for me and who hadn't. I called Renee the next evening. I told her I wanted to talk not about the house, not about paperwork, but about us. She came over on a Saturday morning and sat at my kitchen table, and I told her the full picture, calmly and without anger. The loan that was never repaid, the Christmas he skipped, the hospital visit that lasted 40 minutes, the document he'd drafted and brought to me 4 days into my hospital stay without her full knowledge. Renee was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "Dad, I knew some of it. Not all of it. I'm sorry." She looked at her hands. I think I've been telling myself it was just how he handles things. I told her I wasn't asking her to make any decisions that day. I told her I loved her, and nothing about that was changing. But I said there were going to be some things I needed to do to protect myself, and I needed her to know about them rather than be surprised by them. I had Dennis send Marcus a formal demand letter the following Monday. It outlined the promissory note, the outstanding balance of $88,000, and gave him 30 days to respond with a repayment proposal. The letter also stated clearly that no discussion of any real estate transaction involving my primary residence would take place without my independent legal counsel present. Marcus called me 20 minutes after he received it. He was not calm. He said the letter was insulting and that he'd been trying to help me. I let him talk. When he finished, I said, "Marcus, I want to be straightforward with you. I'm not angry, but I'm also not confused anymore about what's been happening. I'd like to resolve the loan properly. If you want to talk about anything else, we can do that with Dennis present." He hung up. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Renee. She told me she and Marcus were separating. She said it quietly, without drama, the way my daughter has always handled hard things. She said there had been other things she'd found out, financial accounts she hadn't known about, conversations he'd had with a real estate attorney before my accident that suggested the house discussion had been in planning for longer than she realized. She asked if she could stay with me for a while. I told her the guest room was already made up. The repayment negotiation with Marcus took 6 weeks and ended with a structured settlement, $74,000 paid in 2 installments, with the remaining balance forgiven as part of the separation settlement process. Dennis told me I could have pursued the full amount. I told him 74 was enough. I didn't need the last 14,000. I needed the acknowledgement. Marcus paid the first installment on a Thursday morning via wire transfer. Dennis sent me a confirmation email. I read it sitting at Carol's kitchen table, the same table where Renee had eaten breakfast for 18 years, where we'd done homework and argued about curfews and had Thanksgiving dinners with her grandmother. The morning light came through the window the same way it always had. My ribs healed over 10 weeks. The shoulder took longer. I'm still doing physical therapy twice a week. The business is running well. Ray has taken on more of the day-to-day, which turns out to be good for both of us. Renee and I have dinner on Sunday evenings. She's doing well, considering. She's tough in the way her mother was tough quietly, without announcement. Some Sundays she talks about Marcus, and some Sundays she doesn't. I follow her lead. I've thought a lot about what I would say to someone in the situation I was in a year ago, lying in a hospital bed, watching the door, waiting for someone who wasn't coming. I'd say this: the loneliness of that room was real, but what it showed me was just as real and just as valuable, even when it hurt. There's a difference between the people in your life who see you as a person and the people who see you as a resource. Usually that difference is invisible. It takes a moment of genuine vulnerability, a hospital bed, a crisis, a loss, to see it clearly. When that moment comes, pay attention. Don't explain it away. Don't tell yourself it's just personality or stress or that you're being too sensitive. I spent years being too understanding, too patient, too willing to absorb costs, financial and otherwise, because I told myself that's what family does. And maybe it is, but family also shows up. Family sits in the uncomfortable chair next to the hospital bed and stays longer than is convenient. Family doesn't walk in on day 5 with a folder of paperwork. My house is not for sale. I had the exterior repainted last spring, a warm gray that Carol always wanted, but we never got around to. The hydrangeas she planted along the back fence came back this year, which they sometimes don't. I stood in the backyard one evening and looked at them for a long time. I'm still here. The house is still mine. And I know with a clarity I didn't have a year ago exactly who was in my corner when it mattered. That's not a small thing. That's everything. There's something that happens to a person when they're lying alone in a hospital room, waiting for a knock on the door that never comes. The silence isn't just quiet, it's clarifying. It strips away the stories you've been telling yourself about who loves you, about who shows up, about what all those years of giving actually built. Walter found out the truth about his son-in-law, not through an argument or a confrontation, but through 4 days of empty chairs and unanswered calls. That kind of absence speaks louder than anything said out loud. What Marcus did wasn't a sudden act of cruelty. It was the result of years of small choices, taking without returning, dismissing without noticing, planning without honesty. People rarely become who they show themselves to be in a crisis overnight. They become that person slowly, one convenient shortcut at a time, one loan unpaid, one holiday skipped, one folder of paperwork drafted in secret. The crisis doesn't create the character. It just removes the cover. And Walter, for all the years he absorbed the costs, made the excuses, told himself it was just personality differences. Walter also made choices. He chose patience when he should have chosen clarity. He chose to stay quiet when the promissory note went unpaid. He chose to look away from the Christmas that his son-in-law skipped, the first one after losing Carol. Those choices weren't weakness. They came from a genuine place of wanting to hold the family together. But intention doesn't change outcome. Kindness without boundaries doesn't build trust. It builds expectation. The moment Walter decided to pick up the phone from that hospital room and call his attorney, everything changed. Not because of the legal documents, not because of the repayment demand, but because of what that phone call represented. A man choosing, finally, to treat his own life with the same seriousness he had always given to everyone else's. That decision required something harder than anger. It required honesty about who Marcus was, about what the marriage to Renee had been covering, about what Walter himself had allowed to continue for too long. Moral courage isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It looks like a quiet conversation at a kitchen table, telling your daughter the full truth without bitterness. It looks like sitting in a lawyer's office going through 20-year-old paperwork. It looks like choosing not to pursue the last $14,000 because you understand the difference between what you're owed financially and what actually matters. Renee is rebuilding, Walter is healing ribs and shoulder and something deeper than both. The hydrangeas Carol planted came back this spring. The house is still his. None of that happened by accident. It happened because one man, in the most vulnerable moment of his life, chose to see clearly and act with integrity rather than collapse into bitterness or dissolve into forgiveness without accountability. That is what resilience actually looks like. Not toughness, not revenge. Just a person who finally decided that the life they built was worth protecting and had the quiet courage to do exactly